All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA UCOM speaker session entitled Analyzing Election Disinformation Efforts by Foreign Actors. I'd also like to briefly thank today's speakers, Dr. Todd Helmus, Dr. William Marcellino, and Dr. Marek Posard for taking the time to present today. So just a few quick housekeeping items. We'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. And throughout the brief or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 is a question mark. Also make sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded, go ahead and submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to the question. So I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers real quick before I turn the floor over to them. Dr. Todd Helmus is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation and a member of the Pardee RAND Graduate School faculty. He specializes in disinformation, terrorism, and strategic communications, and his latest research focused on ways to counter Russian disinformation campaigns in the US and Europe. Dr. Marek Posard is a military sociologist at the RAND Corporation and an affiliate faculty member at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. His primary area of research focuses on social problems in military organizations, and in the past, he's looked at unit cohesion, countering disinformation efforts, military families, the recruitment and retention of personnel, and modeling the will to fight. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Bill Marcellino, who is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation, a professor of text analytics at the Pardee RAND Graduate School, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. He was also trained as a sociolinguist and a corpus linguist, and at RAND he develops analytic tool sets. He also teaches text analytics methods for big data sets, as well as qualitative research methods. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow our presenters today to start sharing their screens. All right, so Todd, go ahead.
Todd, you're muted.
Okay, hopefully I'm showing the screen.
Yes.
Okay.
So I can, would you like me to begin the introduction, Todd?
Pardon?
Would you like me to begin the introduction?
Yeah, it's your show.
Great. So yeah, my name is Mark Posard again. I'm a military sociologist here at RAND. I was one of the project leaders with my colleagues, Todd and Bill. This project really looks at election interference from foreign adversaries, particularly focused on Russia. If you go to the next slide, please. The California Office of Emergency Services asked the RAND Corporation to help them analyze, forecast, and mitigate threats to the 2020 election. And so this project has 4 reports, 3 of which are publicly available, and the 4th one is currently in press and will become available probably in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So the first report really looks at how Russia targets our elections, and it's a review of the literature to understand the logic by which we believe the Russians are tried to target our elections in 2020 as well as in 2016. The second report looks at how Russia goes about doing this, and particularly who they are targeting on social media. It involves developing machine learning toolkits to understand what types of targets that Russian trolls are focused on in terms of various online communities during the early part of the 2020 election. And then the third report really asks the question of, does it work? And so we take known Russian content that's been used from the 2016 election, and we run a randomized clinical trial to really see if the impacts of this, what the impacts are on individual users, as well as various types of interventions that might work. And then finally, the last report tries to answer a simple question of what we can do about it. And what we did was we did focus groups as well as individual interviews from people from that survey experiment to get their thoughts and feelings about various types of Russian content. And then we tested a public service announcement on these individuals to get their input from viewing this content. Next slide, please. So I'll talk briefly about the first report, which is really a framing for much of the other lines of effort that we have. If we go on to the next slide, we can give you the bottom line up front. And the bottom line really is that we believe that Russia is trying to manufacture political paralysis in the United States. And we believe there's a rhyme and reason to how they do that. And that rhyme and reason is largely based on reflexive control theory, which was a Soviet era theoretical research program that really looks at how one can alter perceptions of conflict with other groups of people. In essence, what we found is that what Russia does is they figure out which groups of people dislike whom, and then they pump the information space to basically amplify pre-existing conflicts. The goal is not necessarily to change people's behaviors, but to elicit strong reactions in people. The end result, hopefully, from the Russians' perspective, is to reduce the probability that people from different backgrounds can find consensus on issues of public concern, or at a minimum, they just go to extreme positions, or they just check out completely from the democratic process. We've outlined various types of tactics that are known that the Russians have used to achieve these outcomes. And the key findings from this first report are, again, very general in nature, but it provides a framing for the other lines of effort that we'll talk about in a moment, is that, first off, foreign interference in U.S. politics is not new. This is not the first time that the U.S. has been to this rodeo. Russia has been doing this. The Soviet Union tried it on us. The United Kingdom has tried it on us in the early days of World War II. The French tried it on us during the Civil War. Current Russian information efforts, however, are much more sophisticated insofar as that they're able to utilize various streams of media streams to push out content that to some degree is effectively driving people to extreme positions. One thing to note today versus in the past is new technologies make it far, far easier to launch these information efforts, and it reduces transaction costs. These could be done on the cheap, and other countries and adversaries have taken notice, and we should not be surprised that other countries and adversaries will be trying the same thing probably now and in the future. Next slide, please. And just some general takeaways from our first report, which again is very general, and it provides a frame for our other reports that we'll talk about. There's a lot of literature on user characteristics and certain types of subject matter that are more likely than not to be spread online. There is some strong evidence that general warnings may be more effective than content-specific warnings. One thing that we have noted is that for our sponsor and for people in general is you don't want to get into the weeds and call out particular pieces of content and start just debating various issues that the content's trying to address and amp people up about. Instead, you want to give people a strategic frame and a general warning as to why certain types of adversaries might be trying to launch these types of efforts. And then finally, machine learning classifiers are a popular method, largely because a key stream of delivering this type of falsehoods online is various social media platforms. And Bill, my colleague Bill, in a moment will talk about some of the really, I think, innovative technology that we developed in-house to start kind of analyzing, scoping out the problem and scoping out where the threat may exist. Finally, I just want to note that our recommendations, again, for this first report are really looking at anticipating likely targets and designing interventions to protect potential targets. We found evidence, and there's been evidence in the past, that the Russians in particular are equal opportunity exploiters. They're pretty shameless. They will target Black Lives Matter groups in the United States. They'll also target white nationalist groups. So if they can find an opportunity where there is a cleavage or a fault line in our society, they will take advantage of it at scale. And so the key is to really figure out interventions that can protect those vulnerable populations. And we talk about some more specifics in the other reports in a moment. One thing I just will note before I hand it off to Bill is that public exposure of the broader strategies and practices are important. And this is something we actually found in our last report as well too, is that people don't quite understand day-to-day why Russia or any other country might be putting out certain types of memes or content that are promoting gun rights or promoting patriotism or promoting LGBTQ rights or promoting Black Lives Matter. And so one thing that is going to be important is really giving people that frame of reference to understand why this is going on so they can be a bit more critical when they consume information on whatever platform or whatever media outlet that they are viewing or seeing at the moment. So with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague Bill, who can talk more about what I think is a really cool machine learning tools that he helped develop or he led to develop. Over. I think you might be on mute, Bill.
So yes, I was. Thank you. So our goal here really was to try and do in-time detection. So prior to this, when we've done analytic efforts to try and uncover foreign election interference or these sort of large-scale operations or malign campaigns over social media, it's always been after the fact, sort of like closing the barn door after the horses left the barn. In this case, the mandate was do it quickly enough to actually respond. So that was our sort of framework for this. Todd, would you go to the next slide, please? So we ended up collecting a large social media data set. In this case, Twitter conversations between January 1st and the end of May in 2020, all around the general election. So we had 2.2 million tweets from about 630 unique Twitter accounts using a set of Boolean search terms to get talk about the election. We then went on to go ahead and use a community detection algorithm to turn this large mess of data into sort of meaningful subsets. And it's really important because it boosts the signal to noise ratio for any other further analytics we want to do. We used human machine text mining. So we had experts and have expert human analysts able to look at really large data sets quickly using text mining, and therefore leverage both scalable means from machines, but also human high context knowledge and understanding. We then used supervised machine learning. We had a data set of known trolls. We trained on that data set to then see, hey, can we find something that sounds a lot like this? We also used human analysis of the most troll-like to sort of be a validity check. We use statistical methods to try and understand were there any anomalies, and we found a pretty large botnet that way. And then finally, we wanted to sort of see what are they doing? Was their tradecraft in turn, once the machines had found these bad actors, what can we understand about their TTPs? And I want to give you all sort of two main things. One is I want to share some of the content. So what were they doing and how are they trying to impact and affect the election? I think that's of interest to this audience. But also, I want to talk something about the methods, because I think these sort of newer methods and the sort of boundary pushing and technology, especially for machine learning, is also relevant to across DoD. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, the first step here is to try and build what I would call an OIE overlay, an Operations Data Information Environment overlay, kind of like intelligence preparation of the battlefield, making an overlay. I start off with this giant pile of undifferentiated social media data. I've got 2.2 million tweets, this big, massive conversation about the election. I can't do much with it. There is too high a noise to signal ratio. So the first step is to use, in this case, we use a kind of our own particular version of Louvain modularity, a way to say who talks to who, and therefore how can we algorithmically determine who's part of a group of people that share an interest and are socially bonded together. So we wound up with, as you can see, this sort of large network diagram of groups of people, and these are anywhere from tens of thousands to close to 100,000 accounts, all talking to each other very frequently, and then talking to the other communities a little less frequently. The important part, though, is they're all numbered. The algorithm is stupid. It knows, hey, these 79,000 accounts are all talking to each other very, very often. They are a group. They share an interest stake, but doesn't know who they are. To understand them and make sense of these groups, we then use human machine text mining. So I have analysts in a seat using Randlex, our software, to quickly inspect the patterns within each one of these pockets of data or these buckets. And then on the right-hand side, we can then label it. We now understand who is talking to who, what they care about, and what their angle is. Next slide, please. So you can see on the right here, what we found was this sort of rhetorical battlefield over the election. So we have this large pro-Bernie Sanders community, this large pro-Biden community. You can see on the left-hand side there, this anti-Dem conspiracy theory, maybe also pro-Trump, but very deep pro-Trump, very deep QAnon, deep, a lot of deep states kind of stuff, and very anti-progressives. You can see an impeachment/Russia collusion group, people that were talking about the impeachment proceedings and very eager about the former president being convicted of collusion with Russia. So now we know who's talking to who. And in this visualization, the size of the node is kind of how important they are in the conversation. And then the thickness of those lines, the edges in between them, show how much crosstalk there is, but also the arrows for the directionality. So for example, you can see that the pro-Biden community and this impeachment Russia collusion community were engaged in a lot of crosstalk. Within this, because we had now this sort of more segregated and more refined data sets, and we lost a lot of the sort of the noise, we could do two things. Machine learning, where we found troll accounts. And by trolls, we mean fake persona that matched our machine learning model of prior Russian troll activity from the 2016 election. And not only did we find them, we found that they were unevenly distributed. So one of these very suspicious aspects of them is not only did they really match our algorithms or our machine learning model, they were clustered in some communities purposefully and not clustered in others. They were not randomly distributed. They were targeted against certain communities. Second part is we did a statistical analysis to look at friend to follower ratios, which are throttled or capped by Twitter. It's really hard to get to a very big number evenly because of these throttles that Twitter has, unless you are like a blue check mark, you're a verified one. So we found all of these super connected accounts that were either the exact limits for Twitter or one-off. Again, very suspicious, and seemed very ideally suited for spreading disinformation, spreading hashtags, for example, retweets. And again, they were concentrated in certain communities and not in other ones. Please, next slide. So you can see there in that left-hand table, the pro-Biden community was targeted by our super connectors. So that bot network made up almost 11% of the accounts in there. 21% of the sort of pro-Trump one and 11% of the impeachment Russia collusion one. On the other side, the trolls we found, which are really kind of absent in like wider general discourse, they were strong in this data set we had and very strong in the anti-Dem, pro-Trump one. 8% of them look like trolls, were identified as being highly like trolls by our machine learning model. 6% of the impeachment Russia collusion, and then 6.3% of the libertarian community that we found. If these had all been distributed evenly, it would have been more like 2.5% per community. So clearly there was targeting going on. On the right-hand side, these are some of the tactics. They're very parallel. In the middle there, all of the trolls, left-wing and right-wing trolls, were sharing content about how Jeffrey Epstein, any moment now, a bomb's going to drop on Epstein that indicts the other side. They also both talked about Black Lives Matter. Either Black Lives Matter is very favorably for the left-leaning ones, for the right ones that they're like thugs and that kind of stuff, a lot of racist content. And then finally, both sides talked about coronavirus, really played it up. The right-hand side saying that the Dems will use coronavirus to stuff the ballot illegally and have a fraudulent election, and the left-hand side saying that the right-wing people and Republicans will use coronavirus to unlawfully suppress the vote. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there was a lot of content where they used really awful, really awful racist and sexist photoshopped pictures and content about former First Lady Michelle Obama, and then a lot of negative content about now President Joe Biden. A parallel strategy on the left-hand side, all of these left-wing trolls were pumping out really gross, photoshopped, sexualized images of the Trump women, and then a lot of negative content about former President Trump. So really parallel tactics that were clearly meant to inflame hyper-partisans on both sides. Next slide, please. This is an example of how the botnets worked. And when I say botnets, what I can say is these suspiciously connected accounts. I can't say for sure they're bots, but they look like bots. They act like bots. They function like bots. On the left-hand side, you can see that a regular old hashtag, Caucus for Bernie, that was sort of distributed normally after the Nevada primary, was almost overwhelmingly shared by accounts that also did 10 or more total hashtags. That's normal behavior. When you use hashtags, you use lots of them. So almost every single account that shared Caucus for Bernie in our data set in our period, did 9, 10 or more total hashtags. Totally makes sense. You don't just use like one hashtag. Look on the right-hand side. The Bernie1 hashtag, which launched the moment the moment the primary closed down, well in advance of a declared winner, was very strongly shared by accounts that woke up one time to tweet one hashtag and then stop tweeting hashtags again. That is highly suspicious coordinated activity. And it was right after when it happened. This looks like a boosted hashtag effort by these troll accounts. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the superconnectors or botnet ones. So you can see on the left-hand side, Yang Gang, which was like used by Yang supporters, very legitimate hashtag. It was mostly shared by people with less than 5,000 friends, like ordinary people. All these regular people, almost everyone who shared this Yang Gang tweet for this like little 1 hour, 1 day window we picked out was doing is a normal account, less than 5,000. Only a tiny fraction had a lot of friends, which is possible. It's possible. It's just not very regular. On the right-hand side, you can see that same period, the misspelled beauty gig one, and not that it's misspelled makes it necessarily suspicious, but it was overwhelmingly shared by these super connector accounts, which are very rare on Twitter. And again, look to be an engineered botnet sharing a hashtag, and they got it wrong. They misspelled it. Not surprising for a foreign effort. So this is an example of the kind of boosting TTPs they used. Next slide, please. And I want to show you something pretty cool we did. That's an innovation we did in our machine learning. We wanted to use the accuracy, precision, and power of industry standard deep neural networks. So right now, an approach called word embeddings that accounts for word sequence and word location. It's a very powerful way of trying to do machine learning for text, and that also uses deep neural networks. So the current industry standard DNN, it's very powerful. It works very well. It's being used all the time. Every time you use Google, it's being used, but it's non-interpretable. It's a black box. You can't ask the machine learning algorithm, hey, help me understand your tradecraft. How'd you find these bad guys or whatever? That's a real problem. We combined it in a novel way with a simple stance model. Hey, tell me what are the rhetorical moves being made? Less powerful on its own, but when the two are paired together, they vastly improve performance. And if you look on that on the right-hand side there, you can see the Matthews correlation coefficient scores where those arrows are pointing to. You can see that a deep neural network did good on our training data, 86%, and pretty darn good on real data, almost 80%. So pretty good troll hunter, 80% using a deep neural network. When we did stance only, even better, right? 83% on our training, on our evaluation data, which is what you want, by the way. I don't want to do good I don't want to do good on practice and then do crummy on the test. I want to go from being good at practice to being good on the test. But if you look at the bottom one, an enormous improvement from our hybrid DNN plus stance model. So this is a big innovation in machine learning modeling. And the really cool thing is we can ask the model now, tell me how you worked. If you look on the left-hand side there, I can ask my model, tell me how you functioned. And yeah, a third of the performance was from deep learner. That's as far as I can go. But 13.5% was from abstract concepts, talking about like things like Social Security and Medicare and time and money and non-physical things in the world. An important thing is person properties and sense properties. They contributed to the model strongly. That's the way of talking about who you are in the social world. Black cops, white men, sons and daughters, negative events like murder or racism. So we were able to actually build a model of how these Russian trolls function. And basically on both sides, they function primarily by talking about problems in the world and pinning them on social problems. Like either from the left-hand side, it's a racist America that is, dominating legitimate people and harming, and needs to be responded to immediately. On the right-hand side, we're in a world threatened by immigrants, threatened by Muslim terrorism. We need to go ahead and clamp down on them right away. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit more of an understanding of how this stuff works within the, I'm going to skip over this. We've done this before for prior work. I'm going to skip over this actually. Same kind of idea on the 2016 election, same things we found. So this is again consistent. What I can tell you here is that Russia seems to be using the same trolls and the same tactics. Todd, could you go forward to the next slide? And just to understand what I mean by stance here, this is a very simple machine learning example trying to detect sarcasm and irony. We're using Amazon reviews. We have a really good corpus of like normal reviews on Amazon. Hey, I bought a bike. It worked pretty well. I'd buy again for my kid, 10-10, good bike. Versus sarcastic reviews on Amazon. Great job, guys. A bike that falls apart and makes your daughter cry on her birthday. Please do it again hard next time, you blanks. So by adding stance in, which captures this kind of social thing like, hey, great job, you morons, that sort of tension of good and positive together or intensity, you can see that we can get some on the left-hand side, small improvements on non-ironic data, but really big improvements on the right-hand side on ironic data. It's really important to be able to detect not just, we're already good across the enterprise at detecting content, being able to get emotions, social interactions, social intent, the social cultural elements of text is a massive improvement in machine learning and one that we need to see spread farther out throughout the enterprise if we want to advance machine learning. Go on to another slide, Todd. If we can advance to the next, there we go. Actually, we advanced one more. So really being able to not just have a machine algorithm go out and find, bad guys or something else. Hey, find me terrorists, find me people that talk in a threatening way. Distinguish between, tweets or other social media content that is a threat to the force versus things that are just expressions of anger. Being able to also have an analyst, not just have this top huge view at the large statistical level and the machine learning level, but also be able to dive down and understand how it actually works. And this is an example. This is how Russian trolls talk about problems from a right-wing persona standpoint. They're narrating how there's all these negative things happening. I'm sorry, this is from a left-wing perspective, trying to narrate the world as America is a fundamentally racist place where there are huge social problems that have to be addressed right now. So I can go up and down between this sort of large scale analysis to find patterns and do machine learning, but then dive down to see and understand tradecraft. One more slide. Go forward, Todd, please. And not only to be able to do this in English, but be able to do this in native languages, in Arabic, be able to do it in Russian as well. So the ability to do this kind of very sophisticated work where I can both do machine learning at scale, really powerful stuff, but also leverage the attention and understanding of my analysts. I can do it natively in Russian, natively in English, natively in Arabic. Our next language is Mandarin. That's also a powerful improvement we think needs to be understood within the enterprise. Todd, take over, please.
Thanks, Bill. That was great. All right, so I will brief the task 3, which is our sort of experimental assessment. And essentially, the question is, so with these trolls and the social media content that Russia is or some other actors putting out, how effective is it, and what can we do about it? All right, so just real quick, I want to highlight just some past work that's relevant to this. And really the most important thing is this work on the right side of the screen that we just did looking at evaluations of CVE campaigns, and I was able to brief it to this crowd a couple months ago. But point being is that the work doing experimental evaluations of impact of content and online surveying really played a big role in us being able to do this work, as you'll see. So what does Russia do? Like as Marek said, Russia is really targeting the U.S. with politicized memes, and these memes are not factual. They're not. There's nothing that a truth detector. I guess there's no truth detector, but that fact checking will really do for you in terms of either detecting the content or really more like helping audiences not believe the content because it's not factual and it's really speaking to people's guts. which is really in line with what psychologists call the peripheral route of dual process persuasion. In other words, you can be persuaded in one of two ways. You can either tell me the facts, and I cognitively think about those facts, and I agree with you, and then I'm persuaded because I really think carefully about something, or I'm not thinking carefully about it, and you're trying to persuade me with emotion, get my emotion going, and that can be another very effective route to persuasion, and is really the route that is used on these types of memes. So we wanted to look at 3 different types of interventions for this study. One was looking at, can we inform, what happens if we inform people of the source? In other words, tell them this is Russian propaganda content. Does that change how people view the content? And we thought that was an interesting question because you're speaking to the crowd on these things, right? And you're sending right-leaning content to right-wing audiences who are really predisposed to believe it. And we thought it could stand a reason that they don't care if it's from Russia or not because you're speaking to the choir. We also tested 2 media literacy interventions. One was a video, a 90-second video that was created out of stock by an organization called IREX, and they do international education programming. So they pulled a stock 90-second video out, and they also came up with 6 different memes. You see one of the memes here on the right. This is part of a campaign that they were already putting out this related content, and they just changed it a little bit for us. So you see here, take 20 seconds to wash your hands, getting people to think about what information they're consuming. Other memes looked at trying to get people to not share content, trying to get people to look up sources on content, things like that. And the way we evaluated the effect of this was we pulled together a bunch of content, Russian propaganda content. So we sort of mined the databases of Russian memes from 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and pulled out a set of highly conservative memes and as well as a set of highly liberal memes. And then we asked participants whether what they thought about those memes in a sort of a standard questionnaire. We would ask them about their emotional reactions. And we'd also ask if they would intend to like or share it on Facebook. And then here's the design. We recruited, because the study was for the state of California, we recruited largely 1,700 participants, largely from the state of California. We would basically recruit them using Facebook ads. And then we had them do a baseline survey, and then we randomly assigned them to one of 4 groups, either a control group that looked at sort of meaningless memes, and then the set of Russian propaganda memes, in which case they were blind to the source, or they were informed of the source. So they looked at a bunch of placebo memes or meaningless memes, and then they were shown the Russian propaganda content, but were told the source of it. Or they saw the media literacy video, after which they saw the Russian propaganda memes, or they saw the media literacy memes, after which they saw the Russian propaganda content. So that was our design. So as we expected, true to form, the Russian propaganda really generated strong partisan reactions. So right-wing audiences, as you could guess, really liked the right-wing content when they were not aware of the source of this content. So they really liked the right-wing content. The left-wingers, those who were liberal, really liked the left-wing content, and everybody liked the pro-USA content. You know, and I should make a note here that a good number of the content Russia put out was for some reason very patriotic content, a lot of content about flags and veterans and things like that. And I can hazard guesses as to why they might do that, but it was, you know, of course it was quite popular, as you would expect it to be. Now, in terms of the interventions, informing participants of the meme's Russian source, the big effect that we had on that, in addition to reducing likes and shares, was it blunted the audience's emotional response. And that's one thing we found with this content, that when people viewed politically similar content. In other words, when right-wing audiences viewed the right-wing content, they reported a very strong emotional reaction. And same for the left-wing audiences. They reported very positive emotions, being happy, being glad, being excited, in contrast to negative emotions like being sad or feeling nothing or being angry. So telling people the source, I think, had a big impact on these emotional responses. The media literacy memes really didn't show any effect in our audiences, and inform the audience of the source, and the media literacy video helped reduce intention to like the pro-USA stuff. What we did next, I think might make these results more helpful and relevant, is we used a statistical procedure to develop audience segments. So we had administered a decent size survey to everybody, and we were able to gather a bunch of data about folks, and then using audience segmentation procedures, we identified 5 unique audience segments. And these are really based on their consumption to news. In other words, the intuitive omnivores on the right. Let's see where. Well, I'll just point out that the 2 main relevant segments here were the left-wing partisans and the right-wing partisans. Left-wing partisans looked at the New York Times. They leaned left. They favored the Democrats, and they were least likely to think COVID is a conspiracy, versus the right-wing audience were more likely to get news from social media, got content not only from Fox, but more extreme right-wing outlets like Breitbart. And interestingly, nearly half of them thought COVID was a conspiracy. When we look at the results on this, you can probably ignore the graph, but the main point here is that the left-wing partisans and the right-wing partisans again reacted the strongest to the propaganda content, and that revealing the source blunted the emotional response and reduced intentions to like. And the video reduced intentions to press the like button for the right-wing content. In other words, right-wing partisans, when they were shown the video, were less likely to hit the like button for right-wing content. And we think that this is, so first our takeaways are basically, number one, the Russia content appears to work as it was intended. With the right-wing audiences liking the right-wing content, the left-wing audiences liking the left-wing content. And that efforts such as public warnings or third-party plugins that can highlight the source of that propaganda can hold a lot of value. It not only reduces likeliness to share, but also undercuts this sort of positive emotional reaction, which we think is really important for this pathway I mentioned in the beginning. So you can either be influenced because something gets your mind interested in it and you think about it, or you get influenced because it excites you. So, you know, the fact that the sourcing information decreases that excitement, we think makes it less influential in theory. Online and highly scalable targeted media literacy campaigns appear they can be effective. And we think that you can really make more improvements on these if you actually design that content to be relevant to the campaigns you're testing. In other words, we just pulled this stuff off the shelf. But knowing that the right-wing audience is susceptible to this media literacy campaign, then developing media literacy content with that audience in mind could make it really highly effective. And I think our results show the value of doing proper audience analysis and segmentation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Mark.
Thanks, Todd. I'll talk briefly about the last report in this series, which is currently under publication. And it really is, it tries to hear in people's own words what they think and feel about Russian content. And what we did was we took individuals from that survey experiment that Todd just talked about, and we recruited them into focus groups and individual interviews during the 2020 presidential election. And in fact, almost all of our interviews and focus groups were conducted in October 2020. And so our focus groups really are 3 groups of people that we conducted focus groups with. The first were people who self-identified as liking Republicans and disliking Democrats, strongly so on both. The second group are people who self-identified on our survey that they really like Democrats and they really did not like Republicans. And the third were these independents that didn't really have a view of either political party. And then for our individual interviews, what we did was we recruited 15 individuals from our survey experiment who were from some of these key media consumption groups. And in particular, we focused on partisan right, partisan left, and these analytical skeptics who, again, are kind of torn between both sides. Next slide, please. The big takeaway from this, from our findings, is really this idea that Russia is recycling our partisanship at scale. And I think that's something that you want to keep in mind as we talk about some of the key findings that have not been publicly released yet. And this is only a smattering of a larger set of findings that we just kind of cherry picked to highlight some key themes. But before I get into that, I want to just talk about how we conducted these focus groups and interviews. The first question we asked everyone in the focus groups and interviews was really kind of this broad, simple question. How do you describe yourself? And as a follow-up, how would your family and friends describe you? And then from there, we asked some background questions, and then we showed them 2 different memes that were sourced from Russia that they used in the 2016 election. One was a conservative-leaning meme with Yosemite Sam. The other was an LGBT rights meme that was more of a liberal meme. And then after that, we showed them a public service announcement about disinformation that was based off of the FBI and DHS's CISA's public service announcement that they were releasing. We abridged it just for the purposes of time, and we asked people for their input. And then finally, at the end, we then told people that they were viewing the memes were from Russia, and got their input after that. Next slide, please. The first thing I want to note, and it's not listed on this slide, is that when we asked people how do they describe themselves, and these are people who self-identified as partisan. These are individuals. This was during a hyper-partisan national presidential election, one of the closest in American history. Most people in our focus groups and interviews did not use political terms to describe themselves. They were open about their politics when asked, but one thing that I think is worth noting is the average American doesn't come in here saying, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm conservative. In our focus groups and samples, a sample of focus groups and interviews, the Americans were saying, I'm a dad, I'm a veteran, I am a welder, I like pottery. And very few people mention politics. So that tells us that politics was not this thing that everyone's thinking about and really to discuss in the very beginning. It was something that kind of emerged, and particularly it started emerging when we showed them the Russian content. So these are just 2 examples out of many that we have in our report about the types of responses that people have when we show them this content. And what you can see here and elsewhere is that people are working through difficult, sensitive social issues. And in many ways, these memes were eliciting responses to issues that people may not necessarily have a strong belief on either way, or they might have contradictory considerations that they're trying to figure out. And I would just want to note that we're in this awkward time in our country where I would argue we're probably in a political realignment. What it means to be Republican and Democrat is changing. There's a lot of social issues and social problems that are being discussed and being brought up to the forefront, a lot of social activism occurring in our country. And so there's a lot going on, and it's a bit awkward. And I think what the Russians in particular are doing is they're spotting a tactical opportunity where they can exploit and kind of shift the perspective of some of these issues as a country we are trying to work through. And what you can see here through some of these responses is exactly that kind of responses that people were giving when we were asking them about these memes. Next slide, please. The other thing I think it's important to note was the generalization that people were making about the content that we showed them. So it was one thing to kind of have these ambiguous responses and trying to explain what you think about gay rights and the contradictions that you're working through. But one thing that we saw time and time again throughout our interviews and focus groups was this generalizing about other people. This is directly in line with what we were proposing based on our reading of reflexive control theory, this idea of group-based conflict. And what you found was people making generalizations about Republicans, about God, about people living in rural parts of the country, people who are from California, liberal politicians, Kamala Harris. None of this content directly relates to any of that. And what we were finding was that the reactions that people had to this content not only was leading them to kind of try to sort through their kind of contradictory kind of sets of considerations, but it also started leading them to make generalizations about wide swaths of the population, which again is not super great in terms of trying to promote a productive discussion, particularly on public issues that might be sensitive in nature. Next slide, please. We also showed people the public service announcement. And the public service announcement, overall, people appreciated it. The key things that they appreciated, though, was that it was coming from an authoritative source, the FBI. Most people that mentioned it did not really know what DHS-CISA was, and that's a new federal agency, but they knew what the FBI was. They liked the fact that it was a general reminder. They liked the fact that it was not partisan. And there were a few people that were pushing back on it, but those people were mostly individuals who believe in conspiracy theories or had some really hardened political beliefs, and I don't think anything you tell them could shift those views. But the vast majority of people we talked to in our focus groups and interviews, they appreciated the fact that someone in the government was issuing this general broad-based warning. And in fact, the thing that came up over and over again was that they didn't quite understand why Russia would be making memes and putting them on Facebook about LGBT rights or about our cartoons. But after reading this, it started to make a bit more sense as to what the strategic value was for what was going on. If you go to the next slide, though, this is kind of a key finding from our focus groups and interviews, was this issue of mistaken attribution. Now remember, these were people that already took a survey on Russian disinformation, and we told them that this was a survey on Russian disinformation after they completed it. Nonetheless, when we showed people this content, the vast majority of individuals mistakenly assumed that the content we showed them was from fellow activists in the United States. And this is kind of a key concern. If you go to the next slide, you can see our focus groups show the same pattern. The vast majority, overwhelming majority of people that we interviewed assumed that it was activists and super PACs that were pushing out this content. And when we told them that it was actually Russian content, the two things that came up were, one, people didn't always understand why Russia would be involved with this, but then they started referencing the PSA and it made a bit more sense. But number two, they really didn't like it. You might be Republican or Democrat, you might be pro-choice or pro-life, you might be pro or anti-gun control, but most people that we talked to did not like the fact that Russia was poking their head in reaffirming those beliefs. And this aligns with what Todd was finding in his results as well too, is that we have our own affairs that we're managing. Most Americans do not particularly appreciate having other countries, particularly Russia or any other country, I would imagine, poking their head in and trying to amplify their beliefs once we told them that. The next slide, please. And one thing that came up throughout these focus groups too, I would just note, is that when we told people that this was Russian content, it was very clear that they're telling them it was Russian content, coupled with the fact that the PSA warning that gave them an understanding of the broader strategic reasoning why really kind of crystallized the point for a vast majority of people that we talked to. So I just want to overview our recommendations very quickly. We recommend three things. The first is collecting intelligence, which is exactly what one can do relatively easily using the tools that Bill and his team built, particularly machine learning tools, before an election cycle begins, to start seeing where the Russians and other adversaries might be pinpointing particular tactical opportunities to exploit. Using that information, one wants to release frequently and often a very broad public service announcement that gives people that benchmark of what the strategy is, but you do not want to get into the weeds and start debating particular nuances of social issues that the Russians are trying to amplify. That's only going to backfire in our opinion. And then finally, we recommend the flagging of content on social media for attribution. If we have political content that's being pushed out from other countries, and if social media companies presumably know the sourcing, at least of some of this content, we think it probably would be useful to flag the attribution of certain types of political content, coupled with a PSA would reaffirm that there's actually this risk occurring and hopefully kind of nudge people in a way to be a bit more critical. The one thing I would just note as a concluding remark is that I think another comment made this point as well. We are at a very kind of time in our country where there's a lot of partisanship, there's a lot of debate, it's a bit uncomfortable. And I think what's important to remember is our adversaries are taking notice that this is an opportunity. They're trying to recycle our partisanship at scale. And if you think of the United States as a family, like any family, we have a lot of disputes and problems. But in the end of the day, nobody wants Russia showing up to Thanksgiving dinner trying to pick fights between family members. And that's exactly what they're doing while we deal with some of these difficult issues. So with that, I can conclude and hand it off to others, and we can hopefully have a great discussion. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Bill.
All right, thank you all. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to keep submitting them through the live event Q&A chat as we go through the Q&A. So to begin with, I will combine two questions here, and it's just about the tools that you used. So Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Alfidi from the 351 CACOM said, what open source tools can we use to perform this kind of analysis? And Dwayne Phillips from Detra IT said, what social analysis tool did you use? So they're just asking about the tools that you used for your research.
Hi, so number one, I don't know of any open source tool sets that work in the way we've described and at the scale we've described. So I don't know that open source software right now is the route to go down. The second question was, again, give me the second question.
Oh, the second question was just what social network analysis tool did you use?
So we use RANLEX, that's RAND's in-house text analytics and social media analytics software. So we've got a built-in Louvain modularity algorithm. So which I think could be done. I mean, that's not something that's like proprietary. Essentially looking at mentions, creating a mentions network, and then imputing from the mentions network who belongs to what community, and then visualizing that. So that's in theory something that could be done, I think, by anybody. Over.
All right, thank you, Bill. So our next question is our most liked question, and it comes from Jim Krupe. And the question is, are the techniques that you discuss common and being used by US domestic groups and political parties and PACs? If yes, how do their narratives and techniques differ from Russian narratives?
I mean, I can begin by just saying in general they're picking up on what we already do, and I think that's very clear. I mean, they're recycling it at scale. The only difference is I think they're looking for tactical opportunities where they can shift it to a more extreme position. And so what they're basically doing is looking for the fringe elements in any of these types of movements. And in any social movement, you can see that there's always fringe elements that try to latch on that don't necessarily represent the mainstream beliefs or views or goals. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to amplify that fringe that otherwise would probably go unnoticed. They'd probably be kind of kooky, and you probably would really just ignore them overall. And so what they're doing is they're using the same techniques, but they're just targeting certain types of groups of people that in any other kind of political process, you would potentially try to bring them into the fold or kind of keep them at the fringes. And this goes, again, for Democrats and Republicans, because there's crazies in both parties, make no mistake about it. And so the question is, can they potentially start targeting various groups of people to activate them, to really amplify that voice, to make it seem like there's much more conflict in our system than actually exists? I don't know if Bill and Todd have anything else that they think about this. I think you're on mute, Todd.
I spent a lot of time looking at memes for our project. I'd say the right-wing memes are almost indecipherable from the memes that you would see in right-wing political groups on Facebook and other places. The left, I think, and it's been known before, have not quite caught up on the meme usage in the same way that domestic right-wing groups have. And the Russian use of left-wing memes are very identity focused. So they're like, they're very focused on you're gay, or like, gay memes or black memes. Or they're not so much like, free healthcare memes or anything like that. So I think there's a little bit different in terms of how domestic groups on the left side work. Over.
All right, thank you both. Okay, our next question is, while conducting your research, did you discover any significant links between Russia and QAnon? All right, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so definitely the sort of anti-democrat, pro-Trump community was absolutely rife with QAnon content. It was the single biggest part of it, of their output from the troll accounts. So clearly both the super spreader accounts, the networked ones, but also the troll ones were pushing out constant streams of retweets and content about QAnon. Over.
I could just also note that we had people in our focus groups who directly asked about QAnon, mentioned QAnon, and so they were people who, not many, but there were some who did say to us, "Is RAND a real organization? Are you working for the Russians?" And they did mention issues related like QAnon and Hillary Clinton's emails, and so yeah, it did come up.
All right, thank you. Todd, do you have any comments before we go on to the next question?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you. The next question comes from the Director of SMA, Mr. Todd Veazey, and his question is, early reporting seems to indicate that Russian attempts to influence the 2016 US elections were more effective than their efforts in 2020. Would you agree with this assertion, and can you comment about this variance?
Bill, why don't you start?
So I'll start off here. So we did not analyze effectiveness, right? And that's actually pretty challenging. What we can say is that the sort of spread and connectivity seems to be greater in 2020. So there's more spread, more engagement, more passing on. Whether that means there's more uptake or belief or persuasion, I can't tell you that. What I'll also say is just, and this is a human qualitative perspective, having done a real deep dive on both data sets using similar means, and that is this one was more personal and more virulent. The 2016 was a little more issue focused, like racism, or like threats from Islamic terrorism. This was a lot more personal about Donald Trump, former President Obama. It was more virulently about like the other people and how much you hated, conservatives and fascists. So what I would say is the big difference I would say is that it was much more personal, virulent, and about hating the other people, and a little bit less about like being a very good conservative or being a very good, progressive, concerned with your core issues. Over.
I would just note that it's hard to make that comparison because I think in 2020, I think we had more interventions that were people were focused on this more in the private sector as well as DHS, CISA. But on the flip side of it too, one could argue that the pandemic might make it there are more opportunities to spread certain types of content. I mean, people are sitting at home, they're bored. In some people's eyes, the world seems like it's collapsing before them. And QAnon's exciting. And if you're going to spend hours and hours bored online, why not research a conspiracy theory and in your mind, open up the onion? And so I think there's qualitative differences between 2016 and 2020 to make a strong assessment that one's more effective than the other. But I do think that's where the context really lies, right? Because again, these opportunities arise in different ways, and it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. Over.
My opinion is strictly opinion, is that to the extent that Russia did not implement as much of a campaign as they did in 2016, and I don't know how true that is, but I think some intelligence suggests that might be the case. I don't think they needed to. I think they opened up the onion. They opened up the can of worms in 2016, and we're still trying to put it back together. So I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't try too hard on this year because they didn't need to.
All right, thank you all. The next question is from Dr. Larry Kuznar from NSI, and he asks, if the Russians are piggybacking on our own divisive themes, how can we measure the effectiveness of their efforts amid our self-induced divisiveness? Go ahead, Bill.
So, that is a big assessment. In fact, this is a big question. One thing that we have used that's been effective and is pretty low cost is what's called resonance analysis. And Todd has a publication on measuring the effectiveness or on Russian social media influences in the near abroad. And Todd, you may link to that in the chat. But what we do basically is create large-scale panels in regions, like in cities. So you build a social media panel of respondents who were active over a certain period, say, let's say over a year, in this region, that region, this region, that region. And what you can do is you can build a statistical model of the core language from an effort, right? What are the hallmark language features of that effort? And then what you can do is do statistical matching within those panels against each respondent and then measure the delta. So basically, if I start adopting the language of an effort, of a campaign, that's good evidence of persuasion. If I've started framing the world in this new way, because you cannot talk about the world without making linguistic choices that reflect your cognitive model and sort of where you're at socially. So what we do then is we kind of measure the delta of language person by person on this model of the influence campaign, and then see over time, are people in different regions, are you gaining market share, are you losing market share? It doesn't tell you about like what people talk about at church. It doesn't tell you what they talk about at the dinner table. It's only social media, which skews, it's a biased, source because it skews urban, it skews younger. It's very imperfect, but it's a pretty cheap, down and dirty way of measuring the effectiveness of influence campaigns. And we've used it for Russia. We've used it in the past on ISIS's or Daesh's campaigns as well. Over.
I would just note that you don't want to obsess over this problem, but you don't want to ignore it. And so effectiveness is hard. But when you can kind of get an idea of where there might be an effective campaign, the world isn't falling apart and the sky isn't falling, but it is something you want to address. And I just want to note historically, this isn't America's first rodeo with these problems. Back during World War II, the Soviet Union had an idea, an operation, where they were going to create a African-American Soviet state in the South. And it turned out it failed miserably because black folks didn't really like segregation by Americans, and they certainly don't like segregation by the Soviets. Soviets tried to infiltrate the civil rights movement. They tried to infiltrate and kind of push out disinformation about HIV/AIDS in the 80s. And so in many ways, I think finding these campaigns is one thing. Disinfectant is the best sunlight is the best disinfectant. People do not like foreign adversaries jumping in the middle of the fray and starting to gin up stuff. And once they know about it, we've known historically that people have a pretty negative reaction to it when it's communicated to individuals in the right way that doesn't seem like you're trying to push an agenda. Over.
All right, thank you. The next question is, what is the rationale behind Russia's targeting both right-wing and left-wing supporters? What is the benefit to Russia?
Mark?
They want to paralyze our political system. And so what they want to do is they want to basically, we have a lot of different issues that we're trying to work through. And it's extremely difficult if one person, if your neighbor thinks you're racist and you think your neighbor's un-American, you can't talk about property taxes. And so what they're trying to do is gin us up so we can't have productive discussions. And then hopefully what they can do is they can turn around and basically show the world that we don't know how to manage our affairs. And even more so, maybe that will lead to kinetic social movements where people are actually being violent in the streets, which further just erodes our democratic principles. And by the way, the hope is that they can drive us to extremes. And if we don't get driven to extremes, those in the middle just throw up their arms and check out and not participate in the political process. And so that's a win-win for them. They can tear us down. Instead of building themselves up, they can tear us down. And just remember that they're not the only player in this field. Iran's involved with this. China's involved with this. I've gotten requests about this report from Iranian think tanks. A lot of people are looking at this because they know it's a cheap and easy operation to run. You don't need a carrier. You don't need an F-35 group, right? You don't need an infantry unit. You just need some young people sitting in a cubicle on a troll farm. It's pretty cheap and easy to do.
And
Yeah.
we did a somewhat similar study for UCOM J39 around information efforts around the 2018 World Cup soccer event. And we found a really well-coordinated effort against France and against President Macron. And similar kind of thing. Different hot button issues was the same idea. They had left wing and right wing. They're pushing left ideas, pushing right wing ideas. I don't know that like France is their biggest adversary, but clearly in their mind it was worth a few dollars to spend trying to like make things more stirred up and worse for France, so that France is more focused internally and less externally. Over.
Yeah, I just add on. It's cheap, it's easy, it's scalable. Why not do it? And who knows how effective it is, but look at January 6th, and you can see the effects these types of disagreements have and how constraining and destabilizing it is on a democracy.
All right, thank you all. Our next question is from Andreas de Aragon from the UK MOD, or the UK MOD. And his question is, what are we doing in the West with regards to Russia's or China's intervention in Latin American countries with the purpose of gaining geopolitical advantages, specifically countries holding elections in 2021?
I don't know. You guys know?
I'm sure they're doing something, but we have not studied that. And, I think one of the issues too is like Southcom has less funds to spend often than other GCCs. So we have not done that work, but I think it's worth doing. And I would not be surprised to find that Russia is active in that area. It's cheap, it's probably effective and scalable.
And keep in mind, because I've pitched ideas about disinformation in Central South America before, and these are countries where there's a lot of social problems. There's a lot of inequality. There's a lot of like a history of civil war, and they don't necessarily have a sophisticated, developed, press, and they may not necessarily have a really well-functioning democracy. So it's a really perfect opportunity to do this. And again, I can't speak to any research on it because I haven't done any research on it, but my hypothesis would be there's probably a lot of falsehoods spreading through the ecosystem of Central South America that would be easy to exploit. If I was working for the Russians or the Chinese, I think that would be an ample opportunity to do so.
Well, it looks like that could be a future RAND study. The next question is, it seems that many disregard fact-checking and media literacy as just more propaganda. How do you fight this?
Fact-checking and media literacy? I mean,
yes.
You can argue it's propaganda. I mean, I guess that any beholder is welcome to their opinion on that. But message campaigns, that's what message campaigns do. They try and distill a point of view and trying to get audiences to accept that point of view. And domestically, it's done all the time by non-government agencies and by the U.S. government. So our results suggest, as well as other research suggests, that there's a positive trade-off with this type of content, that audiences actually benefit from it and they change their behavior. And the value of the online stuff is that it's scalable, so you can get it exposed to a large audience within limited resources. So I think it's a potentially win-win.
Just one thing I want to add on to the whole media literacy sort of thing, these efforts. People often point to Finland as a great example of how media literacy is really effective. It's always important to learn from other cultures. If they can do it in blank, okay, maybe you can do it over here. I'd also be careful to think that Finland and the US are identical, right? Finland is a ethnically homogenous, tiny place that's always had Russia looming over it, right? The US hasn't had that. So I'm not sure that what works in a very different country will necessarily be an effective intervention in our country. Over.
Well, I mean, our data suggests it's somewhat effective, and I think there's other studies domestically that show that as well. So, I mean, it's an empirical question.
All right, thank you. And Todd asked a similar question, Todd Veazey. He was asking if you can comment on the widespread media or digital literacy currently being taught in U.S. public schools. And he's asking if it's effective and is it important.
The stuff that's taught in school, so I know there's been a couple studies on this, ours and one other one that looked at online content that suggests that it was effective, at least partially effective. It's no panacea. In terms of the education, the penetration of that type of media literacy training is varied from state to state. Some states do it, some states don't. More are starting to implement it and require it with legislation. The data on the effectiveness of it is not out yet. So how effective is it? How effective is it? It's hard to answer that because those studies haven't really been done to the extent they would need to be.
All right, thank you, Todd. All right, so our next question is from Stephen Downs Martin. And the question is, what research is Russia undertaking to examine U.S. attempts to influence them and to counter those effects? And Bill, it looks like you already commented on this in the Q&A chat, but do you have anything to add to your remarks?
I think you're on mute.
I meant that. So yeah. So what we do know is that they are attentive to our research and other researchers in the U.S. So when we and other researchers expose sort of what they're doing, they respond to it. They argue against it. They've even had cyber attacks, sort of personal targeting. So they're definitely attentive to it. Other than trying to like discredit us or attack us, I'm not sure what they're doing in response to our research. Over.
I personally got a postcard meme in the mail that others have shown is linked to Russian intelligence. So why they would send me a postcard meme, I think it's just a way of saying they're watching me. But it's not very scary, but they send them out. Go ahead, Mark.
I just know two things. A week before the FBI made that Proud Boys announcement, there was a researcher at I think the Ayatollah's think tank in Iran. I think it's affiliated with the Ayatollah, who wanted to have a Zoom call with me about our first report, which obviously that didn't happen because we implicate them in the report and we reported it to proper authorities. So we know other countries are watching too. I will just note that, so I'm a military sociologist by training. There's not a whole lot of us around, but it's a small group. Russia has a military sociologist too. They have actually a sociology center in the Ministry of Defense. They publish research on their force structure. I'd say about 15 or so years ago, they did have a paper, because I sometimes keep tabs on the research that comes out of there. They did have a paper where they were worrying about adversaries potentially targeting their personnel in garrison in certain, faraway installations inside Russia and Siberia, particularly using issues like problems in their manpower system to basically kind of, stir up trouble and reduce morale. So again, they're equally as worried about this as we are, probably in different ways. And I do know some of the Russian literature does cite our stuff, and then in turn, they raise various types of issues and concerns, which they're worried that other people, probably us, are going to exploit them.
All right, thank you all. The next question is, someone commented that they love the Russia is basically showing up at Thanksgiving dinner and creating fights among family members statement from earlier. And this person says, as a data scientist / social scientist, he appreciated the research that you're doing. So now for the hard part. How do we now do this type of research and intervention at scale, and who should be involved in this? The government, and which agencies in the government, the tech platforms, the news agencies themselves, or a combination of all three?
So I'll offer a couple of thoughts here. One, ideally, the Global Engagement Center would robustly be leading, a whole government effort that was agile and effective. That's a big ask. One of the things we often point to is that, it's pretty easy for China, for any authoritarian regime to be like, okay, here's our playbook, and everyone from government to industry to the media cooperates. We don't do things that way in the U.S. So that's hard. And there's a lot of very meaningful differences, legally, culturally, and structurally between, say, DOD and the IC in public diplomacy. So that is just a really hard thing. So the inside USG is a really fraught issue, and the Global Engagement Center was an attempt to move towards that, and hopefully it gets there one day. A second thing that I want to talk about is the platforms. What we found at RAND is that the platforms are wildly variable in their willingness to collaborate and to sort of play ball. So on the one extreme, Todd and I work with Google really routinely and well. We're about to release a study where we helped build them better machine learning models to detect conspiracy theories online. Really cool work. And Google is collaborating with us actively to improve how they can sort of like balance out free speech concerns, whatever, and also make their platform like less harmful. Twitter talks to Marek once in a while when they want something from us. And then Facebook is like I don't know, like a closed wall of FUs. And I don't know how do we do that? You know, like, does government force them to the table with the threat of regulation? Do they decide? I don't know that answer, but I can tell you right now, it's really sort of ad hoc and individual whether or not a platform, and these are massively powerful gatekeepers, whether they want to play ball or not. Over.
I would just note that the active measures working group that the U.S. created in the 80s, when we were seeing problems with this coming up, particularly with operations that were Soviet operations that were trying to target the HIV/AIDS crisis, I think is a good kind of starting point because there's a lot of stakeholders involved. But I think to Bill's point, the distribution channels and social media have really brought down costs and have made it pretty easy to micro-target individuals. And it is against their business interests to really crack down to ensure that people are who they claim to be. There's, by all accounts, Facebook's a perfect example, has a ton of fake users that they constantly are trying to remove. And the question then becomes is how diligent are they being on that? And I think in just being able to confirm that someone is who they claim to be is probably a big step forward. But again, I think it needs to be a collaboration, but there definitely needs to be further regulation and guardrails placed because this is not just an issue of spam on the internet. This is an issue of, bureaucracies within foreign intelligence services making concerted efforts to exploit the deep-seated social problems in our country. And this isn't going to go away unless we have that collaboration, we have some constraints put on these companies.
I'll answer the question by, can you do it at scale? You can't do the research at scale, but you can do the interventions at scale because, from our one study, we have a sense of what intervention works with what population, and it'd be immensely easy to target right-wing conservatives, for example, with media literacy content campaigns on Facebook and other platforms. So that would be easy. I think the GEC needs to fund it internationally, and the DHS needs to fund it domestically, or National Institute of Science. National Science Foundation probably would be a good source for that as well, because obviously the domestic and foreign audiences are sort of split up agency-wise. I think the best way to do the research at scale is to do online research and to create panels of online participants, and then to do my big recommendation is to pair researchers with implementers and sort of evaluate the full life cycle. So you do research on pretest, you do research on audience segmentation, research on, and then you create content, and then you do research on pretesting, then you revise the content, and then you evaluate impact, and then you revise the content, and then you launch the campaign. Over.
All right, thank you all. I want to bring attention next to one of our Air Force Safe 3 sponsors, nicknamed Frag, and bring attention to his question. And that question is, are PSAs likely to be more effective if they focus on countering the content of mis or disinformation or challenging the credibility of the source? Or is it both?
Challenging credibility, I mean, our results suggest that if you can challenge the source or identify the source, that's your best route. Short of that, you can do media literacy. You can, at least in our case, the video would be effective without addressing the source. So that would be the results from our limited study. But right now, if a platform knows the source, they're just going to remove it, right? So if Facebook, in theory, knows that Russia's launching campaign X with content Y, they're just going to remove content Y. But at some point, I think you'll want to have plugins or something like that that help audiences identify that on their own.
Chris Paul, one of our colleagues at RAND, has done a lot of this work in sort of information warfare function, and his research and others has really pointed to the fact that sort of arguing with people and countering their narrative tends to actually boost their work. So it's kind of productive. The more you argue directly with them rather than telling your own story, the less effective it is. So we would say that you don't really want to engage directly and try to like fact check or counter that kind of stuff. You just give it more space and more airtime. Over.
We've recently been connected with Chris Paul at RAND. But thank you for highlighting his work. The next question we have is from Steve Schinkel from the Naval War College, and he asks, did you see bleed over from the social media platforms into the mainstream media, especially with the 24/7 news cycle, and thus going more mainstream and harder to counter?
So in our study, in our data set, that the media sharing tended towards the extremes of both sides. So it was a lot less like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times being sometimes, but for the more troll-like it was, the more it was like Mother Jones or Breitbart or the Blaze or those kind of ones. So they seemed to be speaking to the fringe by citing and recycling more fringe media. Over.
Okay, Todd or Mark, did you want to go ahead? Okay. Okay. Our next question is from Stephen Downs Martin, and he asks, Stephen Downs Martin asks, is Russia leaning more from publicized U.S. research into disinformation or vice versa about how to be successful at disinformation?
I hope they read my studies.
I think they cited one of ours recently. At least Google Scholar said they did. So I could be wrong on that, but I think I saw a citation from someone at a university in Russia. So
I mean, that's the challenge. I mean, there's an inherent challenge to that because they will learn from that. But if you don't do the research and you publish it openly, nobody else learns from it either. So
I will note, as a side note, one of the founders of reflexive control theory, Vladimir Lefevre, he recently passed away. But before he passed away, we emailed with each other because he was a research scientist in one of the UC schools. And he confirmed our hypothesis that he believed that the Russians were using his theoretical research program to inform their operations in 2016. So, I mean, there definitely is kind of that cross-pollination of research that occurs.
All right. Thank you. The next question that we have is, how can we in the West learn lessons from your research on how we can turn Russia's techniques back on Russia? For example, amplify Russian opposition messaging about Russian government corruption.
Mark?
I think there's a lot of opportunities. I mean, I think there is but there's always, I think Bill has noted this in our discussions, as there's attribution risk, right? One thing to note, though, is that people don't particularly like when other countries are kind of trying to push out disinformation. And so being able to flag it, either if it's correct or if that's a falsehood in and of itself, are opportunities where you don't necessarily have to be the one pushing it out, but you can kind of, if you wanted to kind of use that to your advantage. I think the playbook's not that difficult and it's not that expensive. It's just a matter of having the resources to kind of plan it out and have a particular goal in mind. And again, I think the U.S., we have a multitude of different strategic goals. And so the question really is, what do you want to do? How much risk do you want to take? And is it going to achieve the goal that you want? But it's definitely doable.
Yeah, and Mark and I both are sort of skeptical of like the risk involved. Like it probably wouldn't work very well, but technically it's extremely interesting to me. Like I would really love to gather large data sets of Russian talk that we want to go ahead and use and exploit. Find the rhetorical and linguistic latencies in them, and then craft messages. Because like one of the big problems is it's really easy to mirror your way of speaking, not your target's way of speaking. It makes it very ineffective. Like we've all like, hey, Middle East, we have democracy for you. And they're like, we don't want democracy. So it's very technically possible, but again, the attribution risk is pretty enormous. Over.
I think my take would be, Russia does this really slapshot. They're just trying to create a mess here in a lot of different ways. And in my view, that the goal of any U.S. campaign would not be to do that. Would be to think strategically and carefully about what outcomes we want to achieve, and then promote messages that achieve that outcome. So instead of like promoting both the left and the right in Russia, I would think about ways of promoting democracy, pro-democracy audiences and things like that to enhance that message, not to create a cacophony like they try to do here.
All right, thank you. Before we wrap up here, I do want to ask this question about China or other foreign government efforts. And this is from Steve Schenkel from the Naval War College. And he asks if you have any insights on Chinese or other foreign government efforts in this area. And he wants to know if you've seen similar tactics, techniques, and procedures as to that of which Russia uses and messaging styles that Russia uses.
So we're currently doing some work for Australia, like whatever their equivalent State Department is. And so one thing we found is that in that Pacific region, we have found a Chinese disinformation, effort around basically like China's a good neighbor. We're stopping COVID. We're boosting trade everywhere. So when they're pushing out information, one of the big efforts is we're the good guys. They've also been pushing out disinformation that's malign about sort of boosting negative stories about other countries. So they're taking and boosting or creating content about how bad COVID is in America, how bad COVID is in Canada, other places. The other effort I'm aware of has been efforts to try and influence diaspora, so ethnically Chinese communities in other countries, and try and influence them using very targeted sort of coded messaging against them. Over.
I would just note the little bit I do know about China, and there's a really great book on this, is that internally in China, they have pretty sophisticated methods to control information, censorship, but also this idea of friction flooding. They can flood information spaces to prevent content that they don't want from spreading, but also friction to kind of slow down the access to information. And so in some ways, maybe I would hypothesize that maybe it might be a little bit more difficult for them to perfect these methods versus other places where you might be able to kind of a pool of people who can kind of easily access American websites and concepts and culture to be able to kind of pick up on the linguistic cues that Bill's tools have been able to identify. Just because I think it might be more open, but that's a hypothesis. That's an opinion, and a hypothesis based on opinion that's not scientifically tested.
All right, thank you. So we have about a minute left of our speaker session, so I just want to give you all the opportunity to leave us off with any closing remarks before we wrap up here. Any final points that you want to highlight?
I mean, I think the report hopefully kind of bridges some of the domestic issues and bridges it with some of our foreign policy issues and tries to kind of make a link between the two of them. And so hopefully you all can get a chance to read some of the report, and do not hesitate to contact me or my colleagues on any questions or concerns now going forward.
Okay. Well, thank you all for tuning into our Microsoft Teams session today. And thank you, Dr. Marcellino, Dr. Helmus, and Dr. Posard for taking the time to brief us today. So have a great day, everyone.
Take care.